Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining the Brandywine Online for our virtual program, Behind the Scenes, No Solace in the Shade. My name is Bailey Gamberg, and I'm the educator for adult and community programs at the Brandywine Museum of Art. I'm going to start with just a few reminders. We greatly encourage you to come visit in person and see this fantastic exhibition titled Jerrell Gibbs, No Solace in the Shade. The exhibit will be open this weekend to the public, kicking off with a block party opening celebration. Tickets are available for that event on our website if you're interested, but don't worry if you can't join because this exhibit will be here until March 1st, 2026 for visitors to enjoy. I'd also like to share that we have another virtual talk happening on the evening of Tuesday, October 7th, with Wyeth Foundation curator and director of the Andrew and Betsy Wyeth Study Center, Dr. Will Coleman. He will be discussing the development of our other fall exhibition, Cropsey, Wyeth, and the American Landscape Tradition. You can learn more and register on Brandywine's events page. Because we are in Zoom webinar, your mic is automatically muted and your camera is turned off for the presentation. Please feel free to use the Q&A chat function at the bottom of your screen to submit questions throughout the program, and we will get to answering them at the end. We will also be recording this talk and sharing the link out in a few weeks once the video has been edited. We're grateful to have with us today accomplished writer, curator, and art historian Angela N. Carroll, who is deeply dedicated to exploring the legacies and cultural expressions of the African diaspora. With an MFA in Digital Arts and New Media from the University of California, Santa Cruz, and a BA in Visual Arts from the University of Maryland, Baltimore County, Carol's academic and professional journey is marked by her commitment to amplifying the voices of dynamic artists. Carol has contributed critical writing to exhibition catalogs published by the Baltimore Museum of Art, the National Museum of Women in the Arts, the Des Moines Art Center, and now the Brandywine Museum of Art. With that, I will happily turn it over to Angela to share more about the journey of developing this lively and dynamic exhibition.
Hello, everyone. We are so excited. I hope that you guys are all excited too about this incredible and historic exhibition of works by painter Jerrell Gibbs. I'm so excited to show you a little bit of some behind the scenes for the exhibition, talk a bit about what inspired the project and the exhibition, and take a few questions about this really beautiful show so that you guys can come and see it in person. It's where if you see us sort of stargazing, thinking about the epicness of the show, it's because we've been working on it for almost 3 years so that everyone can really enjoy the beauty of his work and his contribution to figurative art and to the canon of art history and painting. I'm going to share my screen so that we can jump into the presentation. Okay. So, again, my name is Angela Ann Carroll. I am an art historian, a writer, and I've been writing about artists with an emphasis on the Upper South and the South, but also broader regions for, I have maybe 20 years into writing and 10 years with an emphasis on the Upper South, really thinking critically about the ways in which artists are documenting their worldview, their reality through the various mediums that they're mastering in their practice. And that has been a great joy of my life to see masters emerge in regions that are outside of major art metropolises, right? Um, I want to start first with a painting called Anger Management by Jerrell Gibbs. Jerrell Gibbs is a Baltimore-based painter who deals with a lot of different themes, largely around his own identity, his family, his history. But when I met him back in 2015, he was working on a series of paintings inspired by the beloved illustrator Charles Schulz, and based on the Peanut series. We all love Charlie Brown, right? Um, Jerrell was really interested in a figure that was a part of the Peanuts circus named Franklin, who was a African American character who very rarely had a voice, very rarely had representation other than a sort of drawing, usually in the background or in a group or communal scene of the Peanuts gallery. But we didn't really get the opportunity to develop and or understand the development of the protagonist of Franklin. Um, Charlie Brown was the protagonist. His relationships with some of the other kind of key protagonists was clear, but Franklin was always a secondary character. And so when I first met Jerrell, he was very, in 2015, he was very interested in the idea of giving Franklin an identity, and also having Franklin serve as a kind of avatar for himself as a child, thinking through key themes and ideas about, in particular, masculinity, right? What does it mean to be a man? How do you, through performances of masculinity, still also deal with emotions, right? Because so much about a presentation of being a man, as many men are taught to perform, cisgendered men are taught to perform, is that of no emotions, no emotional presence, no tears. And so Jerrell was really interested in exploring how does young Franklin grapple with trauma? Um, Jerrell lost his father at a very young age due to a tragedy. And so that comes up often in his work, thinking about how do we, how did he then as a child and now as a man, as a father, as a husband, still continue to think through the ways in which society, culture, indoctrinates young boys to be cold, right? Cold to what they're feeling, cold to the world, and thus unable to process very human emotions. And so, through the avatar of Franklin, Jerrell did a series of small paintings, largely on very small acrylic, I mean, very small canvas, using predominantly acrylics, allowing Franklin to articulate for himself his frustrations, his thoughts about masculinity, his thoughts about his inability to grieve in public spaces because of his need to present himself as what other people expected of him in relationship to his male presenting body. Um, I was I was so inspired by the conceptual premise of the work that I wrote about his work and the power of his work at that time. Um, and this was at a time where a lot of people were being invited to studio visits with him, but not a lot of people understood the work, right? He was working predominantly in primary colors at this time, again, working in acrylic, which is always sort of seen as the stepchild in relationship to, in comparison to oil painting. He was also still working in the same sort of illustrative and graphic, very flat style of Charles Schulz. And so people weren't seeing the sort of painterly component that they expect of a painter. Um, but conceptually, to give voice to a character who otherwise did not have voice, and to use him as an avatar, as a cathartic figurative portrait of himself as a child who was unable to articulate himself at that time, but able to process it now as an artist and adult, I found to be incredibly compelling. Um, this was also against the backdrop of the uprising in Baltimore in 2015, because of the assassination or killing of Freddie Gray. And so there was a lot bubbling in the city in relationship to seeing, particularly Black masculinity, as human. And so for him to take this sort of approach in thinking about a portrait or a character that is a child that is also contemplating these really deep, very existential questions about what it is to be human in the world, what it is to be a born into a male body or male presenting body, what it is to be Black identifying in America, and that he does not have necessarily the tools to grapple with all of the things that he experiences even as a child. I found that to be incredibly keen, very telling and pressing for the moment that it was being developed, and it made me really excited about what he might present moving forward in his practice. Um, as he continued on, he went to grad school at the Maryland Institute College of Art, where I'm also a professor now. And he was able to really develop some of his ideas in relationship to memory, in relationship to trauma, in relationship to grief, and do so in a way that still considered figuration, but also began to abstract the figure in through gestural strokes, through blurring, through what I call a kind of glitch, right? Also, a reference to Legacy Russell, a scholar and curator, thinking about these ways in which, also a reference to Fred Moten, philosopher and theorist, the ways in which blur and glitch also can be a catch-all um, to signify, in regards reference to Henry Louis Gates, memory, the conjuring of memory, memories, the movement of time, the sort of quantum reality of being in one state or presence and then remembering the past, simultaneously jumping from the past to the present, embodying and seeing the past while your physical body is in the present. And so Jerrell was really interested in how one captures that, how one documents that. And he went into a series of very experimental paintings in his practice that moved very far away from his initial experiments with acrylics, with these conceptual themes, but really using the popular icons and iconography of Charles Schulz, and started moving into his own ruminations, pulling predominantly from family archives, from photographs, from family albums, and thinking about family members. And so this painting, North Avenue, that he painted in 2019 is especially profound in that he is playing with new techniques. He's allowing the underpainting to be a theme and also invoke a kind of emotional resonance. He's also allowing for there to be a kind of meta framing that bleeds into each other. You'll notice that the protagonist at the front is less developed than the protagonist or figures at the back. And that's meant to, and he's also enveloped in a kind of veil of sorts. That's meant to conjure what memory, how memory functions, essentially, how thought functions, and what it would look like to document or capture someone in the midst of remembering. Um, North Avenue is also a reference to a popular throughway that runs from East Baltimore to West Baltimore. And so anyone who's traveling in the city of Baltimore to get anywhere else usually is having to go through or ride even for a portion of time on North Avenue. And North Avenue has a significant history of significant accomplishment, but it also has a history of systemic blight, where if you see images of Baltimore City, you may see images of boarded up buildings or boarded up homes, blight, or addictions. And often that's happening on or nearby North Avenue. And so in this regard, titling this work that's dealing so much with memory, time, space, and also opening up new vantages and possibilities for literal new perspectives, but also new processes in the ways in which he's working with paint. This is also one of the first paintings where he is experimenting with oil paint and the ways in which he can use gestural strokes, mark making, blur, and glitch in order to invoke these larger themes around memory. The title of the work is again placing the work within the geographic or regional context of Baltimore City and giving an indicator for those who where this is taking place, where the protagonist is from, but also where the culture, what the culture is that is informing the work. That same year, he went on to continue to do really interesting and experimental themes, thinking about family, thinking especially about fatherhood and absence. Too Soon, which is also included in our exhibition, No Solace in the Shade, is a very rare diptych. Excuse me, one of the few diptychs that Jerrell has done over the last decade. We'll notice that Too Soon is especially, profound for this moment because not only is he dealing with these themes of memory, time, and space, but he's also starting to unpack these ideas of interior, right? How does the home also become a persona and a personality? How does domesticity also become a signifier for identity, for remembrance, for grief, and potentially for trauma? We should pay attention to and just analyze the scene really quickly, right? There's a man on the left who could or could not be a father. We're not sure. We can see really clearly the suitcase near him or behind him. We see in the right paneling, these are two separate paintings that are again positioned next to each other, placed in conversation with each other as a diptych. So they function as one whole narrative, but they're two individual, fairly large paintings. The right painting is a young girl holding a baby doll at the end of a stairwell. Um, Many of the stairs are broken. The She's in somewhat darkness in comparison to the man, in a bit of isolation and desolation. And so in this painting, one is sort of invited to sort of think about a narrative, right? What is happening in this painting? What is the relationship between the two protagonists? Who is being left behind? Are they being left behind? Why, right? What are the signifiers or the symbols of the brokenness, of being able to see the stairs in the composition on the left as whole and finished and realized, and see the stairs on the composition on the right less realized, broken, missing, fractured, fragmented, and thus, we have questions about, are they able to get out? Does the young girl see themselves in relationship to, what is her relationship or proximity to masculinity, to fatherhood, to protection, to safety, all of these sorts of things. This is a significant painting in Jerrell's practice because he's taking a lot of the ideas that he was playing with in a very simplified way through the Franklin series, and then really starting to unearth with the North Avenue painting and conjuring them in a more nuanced and more complicated way through the diptych Too Soon, which we are incredibly excited to present at the exhibition uh, No Solace in the Shade. He then, it's important to note that, some people will say or categorize Jerrell still as an emerging artist, and it's true, he's still relatively young in his practice. Um, Again, the paintings in No Solace in the Shade represent the last decade of his practice. But in that decade, the amount of work that he has been able to produce, the figures that he has been able to honor through the creation of their likenesses, the commissions that he's been able to receive, and the collectors that his work is a part of, private collectors and also major museums all over the country, collectors all over the world, is significant, right? It shows not only the seriousness of Jerrell at this point in his career, but it also through a representation of works from the last decade of his practice, it allows us to see how much he has developed as an extraordinary and very significant artist, American artist, painter, figurative painter of his generation, right? This is a portrait of Representative Elijah Cummings, now transitioned, that he was commissioned to create in 2021. This is a significant painting in that uh, Representative Elijah Cummings was again the representative of Maryland. He was also from Baltimore, and he cared very much about creating pathways for people in Baltimore and in Maryland to be able to have equity, but also to be able to have lives well lived, to have what they needed to live, take care of their families, to make sure that they were well. He was a child of the civil rights movement. He marched and was arrested as a teenager in the civil rights movement. And so Representative Elijah Cummings really stands as a kind of profound example of someone who unabashedly stood up against injustices and really made us all very proud, but also was very proud of the community that he came from. Jerrell's painting of Representative Elijah, the late Elijah Cummings, tries to highlight and elevate that beauty. He did two versions of this painting, one for himself that he keeps in his private collection, and then the first version, which has been shown fairly widely when it was uh, around the time it was first presented. It was shown at the Baltimore Museum of Art, and Jerrell Alston talks about how his grandmother, who had lived in Baltimore City her entire life, came had never been to the Baltimore Museum of Art and visited for one of the first times in order to see this painting, not just because it was a representation of a man who had fought, for civil rights, but also because it was a painting by her grandson at a major institution and museum, also representing a very historic figure, right? And so the bridge building that's happening in 2020, 2021 for Jerrell through the creation of this painting, but also through the invocation and invitation of community members to go into institutions that have historically not always necessarily felt very safe, um, was a major shift, a major change for the artist. And also, again, an introduction to many others to understand how much he had developed over the years and how serious he was and continues to be about his practice. Um, that same year, he began to experiment further with ideas of Black masculinity that break from kind of stereotypes of masculinity and pull more into dandyism, the beauty and the humanity and the style and the cool, right? Of Black masculinity, but also the gentleness, right? Typically, when we think about masculine identity as a whole, um, but especially as Black masculinity is presented to us, it is not in the context of rest. It's not in the context of beauty. It's not in the context of gentleness or love or lightness. It's not in these sorts of contexts that are typically generalized as feminine, but then stigmatized in relationship to Black identity, which is assumed to be hypermasculine, hypersexual, violent in these regards. And so Jerrell, again, master, philosopher, really, very existential in his process, very conceptual in his approach, began to look at French Impressionists in particular and think about the kind of ornate details that show up in their works and consider those in relationship to the ornate details, the beauty of the men in his family that he was seeing when he was reviewing old photographs, especially from the 70s, right, where style and the kind of androgynous aspect that was of clothing, right? Bell-bottom jeans and men wearing heels, right? Essentially wearing bright colors and bold prints. That beauty, right? That was accepted as kind of, very masculine, but also very cool, um, was something that became a point of inspiration for Jerrell in this era. And he did a series of paintings showing men in very dapper attire, very handsomely dressed, very beautifully displayed, often with floral prints and themes, really thinking through these ideas of how do we rupture the stereotypes in relationship to masculinity, first and foremost, and then secondarily in relationship to racial identifiers. How do we break through all of those conditions and be able to really present these humans in their full beauty, free from the constraints of stereotypical framings? Man with Lilacs is a really beautiful and exceptional painting that evidences a lot of the work that he's doing in these regards in this era. We're really lucky and happy to be able to present this painting and then also feature it on the cover of our catalog published by Rizzoli for this exhibition, No Solace in the Shade. Um, in this era, he also began to, similar to the ways in which he thought about Franklin as an avatar for him to unpack his own emotional well being, to unpack his own ideas around masculinity. He's introduced to a new figure that he named Salvador. Salvador comes from a photo album that was gifted to him by another well-known artist named Jeffrey Kent, who's also based between Baltimore and LA. Um, and in there was a photograph of a young boy who had a rather old face. Salvador looked like a child who had been through a lot. If any of you have ever heard the phrase from, older people, look like you've been here before, Salvador had a likeness, an energy that made him look as if he had been here before. And there was something about the image of the young boy who did not have a name on the photograph. All that was written on the photograph was where it was taken, which was in Salvador, Bahia, Brazil. And so, inspired by this man boy, this ancient child, this being that felt very otherworldly to Jerrell, he's painted more than 30 paintings inspired by Salvador, a small series within that larger series known as the Sounds of Color Recorded Memories series, in which all of the paintings of this protagonist, Salvador, are represented in largely very monochromatic color fields, other worlds, uh, different realities, some of them identifiable, others just uh, energetically, sonically, what we would imagine as what a sound looks like if it were a color or on the color spectrum, which we know sound is. And so Jarrell was really interested and inspired by the compositions of jazz, of hip hop, of R&B, but also in the ways in which um, sound and color and the constant varying invocation of this protagonist, Salvador, could function as a means through which for him to process his own emotional well-being and state. And so we're lucky to be able to present 4 paintings from the Sounds of Color Recorded Memory series reflective of this protagonist, Salvador, and varying vantages, beautiful color fields, and worlds in our exhibition this year as well. Um, he continues as the years progress to really push himself in relationship to the figure in scenes that reflect rest and respite. Uh, from 2022 really onward, we see the figure move from domestic interiors, from the living room, from the family room, from the bedroom, into the outdoors, into the backyard, into nature scenes, into that are still quiet and reflective and very meditative. Gone Fishing is a beautiful example of a quiet scene of a man doing something relatively mundane, as many of Gibbs' characters do, and that he's, doing a night fishing. Anyone who, lives, I think Pennsylvania has, probably a fishing culture too, but in Maryland, fishing culture is huge, right? Um, and so to capture and document a scene of rest, respite, contemplation of a man quietly fishing is reflective not only of, again, Jerrell working through these themes of how do we break from the stereotypes of what we think has to reflect or is worthy of reflection of portraiture, but also continues these ideas around how do we represent the ideas of masculinity within the context of quiet, of calm, of peace, and also that are reflective of the culture of the region that he's constantly pulling from, which is Maryland and Baltimore, which again has a big seafood, big sea and water connection, big connection to the water here. Um, that same year, he again is pushing through these themes of what does it mean to gather? What does it mean to sort of think about the ways in which community is reflected in joy, in respite, in calm, in beauty, um, that breaks from the stereotype of people of color gathering and it being assumed that there's some sort of criminality, some violent intent, some gang culture, right? So, End of Summer is a lovely example that we're really happy to include in the exhibition as well of being able to see Jerrell really working with outdoor exterior presentations of groups of people rather than just a sole or solitary protagonist engaged in representations of Black joy, right? But it also, represents a general kind of Americana, right? We can see this scene and it could be anywhere in America, right? It could be in Baltimore, but it could be in Philadelphia. It could be in Detroit. It could be in Brooklyn. It can be in Oklahoma. It could be anywhere, right? It could be in the South. It could be in the North. And so there's a kind of universalizing principle and idea that Jerrell is also playing with these later works and thinking about how do we humanize these experiences. Less, yes, they are identifying and representing Black people, but they also are representing a reflection of the country, right? Of Americana, in the same way that Rockwell represents very mundane instances of celebration, of families, of communities gathering together. Jerrell is really invoking the same sorts of themes and ideas, just from a different lens and from a different part of the country, and from a perspective that we rarely get to see, even now. Um, he continues to showcase these ideas of, and is constantly thinking through the ways in which his father has influenced him, his likes, his taste. He often talks about the ways in which his taste in music, his taste in style, um, as far as what clothing he wears, the things that he likes, is deeply influenced by his father. And though he lost his father fairly young, when he was still a very young child, um, his impact, what he left behind, still continues to influence much of his practice. And so you'll notice that as the years progress, the emphasis on, capturing the way in which light reflects on skin, also capturing a kind of, how does memory and emotional resonance, how do you invoke that? How do you capture that, document that through frames within frames, through protagonists that are in conversation with each other, even if they're in different proximities to each other. And so he really has become a master of this in his process and in his practice at this time as well. Um, we this week actually we started installation on this incredible show, and so we're just tickled pink and very excited to be able to continue to showcase and show this work. I'm showing this image of our team at Brandywine Museum so that you can see just for scale how large the work actually is that is coming in. And so this is one of the paintings that will be on review, but this is so you can see how large these paintings actually are. Here's another painting um, so that you can see how large the work is in comparison to our staff. And so, what's going to be really exceptional about this show is that most of these paintings have never been exhibited before. There are only a few that have. Many of them were created and then literally straight from his studio um, to a to a collector's home. And so many of these paintings are coming right off the wall of collectors who have had these works in their collections over the years, but have not shown these works yet. So some of these paintings have not been shown in a decade or in many years or since they were created. So it really is a great treat to be able to see close to almost 30 works in our exhibition, many of which have never been shown publicly in an exhibition before this moment. So it really is, we're really very excited about it. Here again is another, this one is called The Senses. The previous one was called Double Consciousness. Um, we are very thrilled to show this work. This is a portrait of Jerrell standing in front of the senses now that it's installed at the in the Brandywine gallery with his newborn daughter as they look at and ponder the really beautiful work that he's accomplished that we're all just so excited about, very proud of him and his accomplishment and journey, very proud of the staff at Brandywine for allowing us to stage this incredibly historic and incredibly beautiful and moving show that we're again just thrilled to be able to share with wider audiences so that they can learn who this incredible painter is. Here's some more behind the scenes shots, and many of these photographs are by the great Kelvin Bullock, who's an exceptional commercial photographer and has done some really incredible work. Many of his photographs are featured in the catalog for the exhibition that we're all, again, very excited that Rizzoli has published for us because the work of Jerrell is just so exceptional. And we also have some incredible collaborating writers who have contributed to the work or to the catalog as well, and to the celebration of Jerrell's work and practice. Here are a few of those beautiful photographs from Kelvin Bullock talking about his work and practice and process in the catalog through the ways in which he photographs Jerrell as well. Um, and here's a beautiful last portrait from Jerrell. So I'll pause there because I'm really interested to hear if there are any questions from our audience. Again, No Solace in the Shade will be on view from September 28th through March 1st. We also have a really fun block party event on September 27th. So please do grab your tickets for that event. And thank you guys so much for tuning in for this behind the scenes talk.
Thank you so much for sharing with us, Angela. It was awesome to see those behind the scenes photos and to hear more of your perspective of working with Jerrell and the highlights of some of the paintings in the exhibition. Looking at the Q&A, one of the first questions is, which Impressionist and Post-Impressionist painters influenced Jerrell?
Yeah, absolutely. So Jarell is especially keen on Matisse. Um, the way in which he deals with ornation and decor is really interesting, but he's also, moved by other painters' ideas, thoughts, and ultimately he's trying to riff on what he's experiencing through their practice and through their process and contemplate that through his own perspective as well. So while the French Impressionists, especially Matisse, is especially informative to his work, he's also consistently thinking about how do I review this from my own vantage? How do I think about light? I mean, Caravaggio, who's clearly not an impressionist, but is also especially significant to his practice and process, also plays a part in the ways in which he's thinking about how do you capture light, but also how do you think about light as a means through which to consider emotional presence, right? How do you leave some figures in the darks, make other figures be placed in the light, and then use that as a catalyst to create an emotional relevance and significance to those who are viewing and coming into the work. So thank you for that question.
They also asked as a follow-up, which Black painters have influenced Jarell?
Yeah, so Jarell is encouraged and inspired by all painters who are excellent and master painters. Um, he's identified a lot of incredible painters, and so I would be remiss to name just one or two because I don't want to like pigeonhole his practice within the context of just one artist. But he is truly a student of art. He's truly, he reads prolifically. He studies the ways in which artists work. He's really moved by artists who are masterful with oil in particular. And so he's constantly looking at and reviewing the ways in which artists are thinking through form, thinking through color, thinking through composition, and not just Black artists, but just incredible artists all over the world.
Thank you. Another question is someone asked, does Jarell ever work from live models for his paintings?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. So in this era of his practice, he is still pulling predominantly from archives, from his personal or gifted photo albums. And he's also playing with this idea of memory by revamping, uh, but sometimes the same photograph over and over again in different paintings. So in that regard, we see that most prolifically in the creation of the Salvador series, but we also see it where you may see two or three paintings that have the same protagonist, right? There are two examples of that um, in the exhibition where you'll see a figure recur, stand as the protagonist or be in the forefront of the painting in more than one painting. And you'll have to sort of look at both of them and determine, well, what's happening here? And why is that? And why is there slight variation in these? And why is he using the same figure? He's using the same figure because he's thinking about time, he's thinking about family and place. But in all regards, it is always from a found image, typically more often than not of family members, and then other times, oft sometimes of found photographs of people that he does not know, but feels some sort of connection